This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
I'm Emma Keeling, finding out about a shellfish restoration project that could transform the health of coastal waters.
And I'm Shini Somara, finding out how we can clean up plastics in our waterways using bubbles.
New Zealand is famed for its beautiful coastline and abundant sea life. But under the waves, the scars on the seabed tell a different story. Dredging, one of the least environmentally friendly fishing methods, has torn wild shellfish from their beds and ripped up everything else in its path, leaving a barren wasteland that may never recover.
One of the major issues worldwide is that shellfish reefs, like mussel reefs, have been destroyed on a huge scale. Then you lose that conveyor belt of baby fish that are being fed into your wider environment. Your overall diversity and abundance of fish declines, and people have less fish to catch and eat.
Dr. Andrew Jeffs is a marine biologist at Auckland University, and he says around the world the loss of mussel beds has damaged the health of coastal waters. But in New Zealand, driven by communities, restoration projects are underway using empty mussel shells.
Mussels are amazing because they can form these reef structures which become like living habitats in themselves. They're like coral reef made up of living organisms.
Dr. Jeffs calls mussels the superheroes of the sea. A single mussel can filter up to 250 litres of seawater a day. They shelter small marine life and provide food to the hungry fish. These bivalves can attach themselves to surfaces and each other with threads called byssus. This allows them to adapt to different habitats, whether it's being farmed on ropes or growing naturally on the seabed and rocks. They are also great carbon sequesters. With the rising levels of acidity in our oceans, mussel shells absorb carbon as they grow, around 218 kilograms per tonne. In the North Island, near the city of Auckland, is an area known as the Hauraki Gulf that covers 1.2 million hectares. It's home to a myriad of islands and 5 marine reserves. But overfishing in the past has cleared several areas.
Nearly 1,000 square kilometres of mussel beds were taken out. And when they ran out, the market was still there, but the mussels weren't. So they then moved to other places around New Zealand and wiped out other areas of mussel beds. Those mussel beds haven't recovered in the years since. So the fishery died out in the 1980s, and since then we haven't seen a recovery.
And their loss has been keenly felt by coastal communities who came to Dr. Jeffs asking for help to restore the beds of the native New Zealand Greenlit Mussel.
A community group approached me and said, we want to do something about putting these mussel beds back. Can you give us a hand? Can you, do some research on it to see whether or not it's working when we go ahead and do it? From that initial approach, we've carried on working with community groups, with local Māori tribes.
The idea was to create an artificial reef of old mussel shells that living mussels could attach to. Whose idea was it to use old mussel shells?
It's been well used for oyster restoration overseas, but it hasn't been suggested for mussels in New Zealand. So it was really a matter of giving what's worked for oysters to see whether it'll work for mussels here in New Zealand.
The support they've had has been overwhelming.
We've got companies donating mussels. We've got companies providing us with boats for free. They're aware of what the positive benefits of having a mussel reef in place are, and they're keen to see those benefits coming back.
Beds need adult mussels to produce baby mussels, but they also need something to bind to. So PhD student Emily Benjamin is designing and implementing 3 restoration projects, putting mussels back where they were historically found in the Marlborough Sounds, a system of drowned river valleys formed in the last ice age at the tip of the South Island.
New Zealand's Greenlit mussel is unique in many ways. It's beautiful. It has a very distinct green lip on the outside, where most of the world is used to seeing the blue or black mussel. And also the Greenlit mussels get a lot bigger, and so they're great for farming. And it's become a big fishery for New Zealand, and it creates a lot of revenue.
We see video of the Marlborough Sounds and it looks beautiful, but is it a different situation under the water, and is that due to the mussels being taken away?
In some places where the mussels were severely overharvested, we do see that because mussels used to filter the water and bind the sediment, we now see that there is much more barren underwater habitats that are more muddy and less inhabited overall. And those are the places that we look for to restore the mussels to.
Last year, with the help of multiple different groups, companies and authorities, Emily started the restoration project in Pelorus Sound.
We put down about 12 tons of recycled shell, but with the ultimate goal that we would have about a 20 centimeter thick layer along the seafloor to put the mussels on top of. And then we went down with our rakes and we attempted to rake the shell into these large rectangle areas. And just after one day of the shells being deployed, you could see as I was swimming along that the recycled shell had binded some of the sediment and actually made the visibility in the water just from me diving was better. So I felt that was sort of a big moment for me, because I thought, okay, I think this is going to work and the mussels are going to be happy on this shell layer.
The next step is to put mussels on the shells, and Emily has every reason to feel confident after the success of similar projects in the Hauraki Gulf. In 2012, the Mussel Reef Restoration Trust was formed, and so far, Revive Our Gulf has put down around 180 tonnes of mussels.
So we grow mussels on a mussel farm, and then we harvest them, sort them out and place them on the seafloor to form a bed. And so we've been working at different ways of deploying them on the seabed, trying them at different sites, putting them in muddy sites versus less muddy sites, putting them in exposed sites and less exposed sites to see how well they do and to work out what's going to work best in terms of trying to establish a new mussel bed.
But the Marlborough Sounds at the top of the South Island has a different marine environment to the Hauraki Gulf, so the methods have been adjusted. Is that the first time in the South Island that you've tried dropping old mussel shells?
Yes, and in fact I suspect it's the first anywhere in the world. I haven't seen any other literature of deploying mussel shells to create a new seabed habitat to then put live mussels on to try and get them established more effectively.
In the Gulf, the mussels and the environment are flourishing.
We know that the beds are stabilising the sediment and altering the way the sediment is taken out of the water column and put down in the seafloor. We also know that excessive nutrient coming from fertiliser off the land, they are utilising that nutrient and actually breaking it down. And we also know that the beds have somewhere between 5 and 10 times more juvenile and small fishes living amongst the habitat.
Internationally, these projects are attracting a lot of attention, and Dr. Jeffs and his colleagues have contributed to a global guidebook on how to restore mussel reefs. The ecological benefits will continue to be monitored in the Gulf, while the project in Pelorus Sound is just beginning. Emily and the team gathered 20 tonnes of adult mussels and readied them for their new home at 2 different locations. Down below in the turquoise waters were 12 rectangular plots, 6 on shells and 6 on the muddy seabed, to compare results. It's rewarding work that Emily hopes will see the marine environment flourish for generations.
My dream would be to take my grandkids to the places where I had put the mussels down and be able to scuba dive with them and to see that the mussels are still doing okay, and to see new larval recruitment, and basically that the mussels will have different generations just like I will.
You can see more of Razor on our YouTube channel. Search for Razor Science Show and it will take you straight there. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell button for notifications.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Every minute, the equivalent of one full garbage truck of plastic trash is dumped in the sea. That's 1,440 trucks like this every 24 hours, 8 billion kilos per year. 80% of those plastics come directly from inland areas, washed into the sea by rivers and streams. Engineers in Australia and Amsterdam decided the problem was so bad there was only one thing to do: have a beer and find a solution.
I was studying environmental engineering, and we were visiting a wastewater treatment plant, and at some point they aerate the wastewater to jumpstart certain bacterial processes, and it was basically this big whirlpool of air bubbles, but the plastic was collecting in one corner. And that was the initial spark for me to kind of say, makes sense. Can't I use that in a more directed way? And then I found out that 3 young women from the Netherlands had been working basically on the exact same idea. And for them, it was actually in an evening at a bar that the bubbles in the beer were the spark for the idea to say, maybe we can use air bubbles to catch plastic.
So bubbles in a beer glass inspired the imagination of Frances Zoet, Saskia Studer and Anne-Marika Evelins. And it was the bubbles used for oxygenating a wastewater plant that was the spark for Philip Airhorn.
But how can bubbles clean up the plastic polluting our waterways?
The technology of a bubble curtain has been around since the 1930s, actually. And it has been used to stop saltwater intrusion and stopping oil spills and protecting, for example, the gates of locks from big debris. But then no one really thought about what they're doing, so they just placed a lot of tubing or diffuser heads to create a lot of air bubbles and then to just push it away and keep it away.
After initial interest from the National Water Authority in the Netherlands, they were able to go into a lab to perfect the system.
We just took that basically existing technology and looked at how can we specifically apply it to plastics and then make sure we're energy efficient and non-intrusive for the ecology. And then we used those results to upscale to a large open water pilot. So that test showed that we could capture on average 86% of the test material. We were really surprised by the results, and that was the moment we kickstarted this social enterprise.
This success led to the first operational bubble barrier being built in Amsterdam at the end of 2019. The site was chosen as a significant amount of plastic waste passes through the canal systems, making its way from the city to the North Sea.
What's actually happening with these bubbles?
If we have a glass of beer, of course, the bubbles are kind of like all over the place, forming randomly, and we do it a lot more directed. So we have a single line of air bubbles, and these arise from a tube. It's a perforated tube, and that tube we position diagonally in the river. So the effect is that the rising air bubbles create an upwards water stream, and this is taking up the plastic which is suspended and under the water surface to the surface. And then together with the natural flow of the river, we'll push it then to the side and into the catchment system where we can retain and then remove the plastic trash.
The bubble curtain's position at the bottom of the river allows it to catch any plastic object over 2 centimetres in size that's either underwater or floating.
Are there any implications for wildlife?
By using air bubbles, for us, the great thing is that we can allow fish and wildlife to still pass and use the river as it's intended to be, as well as ship traffic for commercial activities, as well as recreational ship traffic. So for us, that's really what we're proud of, that we found a way to stop plastic pollution in its tracks before it can even reach the oceans, but we don't have to kind of like, be too intrusive and screen everything out of the water, so we can let the ecosystem be as it is. And additionally, in a lot of these places where we have high plastic pollution, a lot of times other pollution comes alongside, and oxygen is often missing in these rivers. And oxygen is very important for fish and a lot of other wildlife.
Okay, so you're actually helping ecosystems with these bubbles.
Yeah, exactly. So apart from the fact that we're catching plastics, we have a positive side effect that we can increase the levels of oxygen, which can be a boost and a support for the local ecosystem.
The Great Bubble Barrier operates 24/7, with the local authority collecting the rubbish 3 times per week. And what happens to the waste plastic next is also important to the Great Bubble Barrier team.
I think when it comes to the plastic topic, a lot of people might still think plastic can just be recycled, or plastic is just plastic. The reality is that the plastic that we're capturing is a wide range, a mix of different polymers, basically, different chemical compositions. And the challenge is not in how do you recycle it, but how do you sort it? How can you identify the different plastic types in your catch and then sort it effectively? And then you only get to the recycling. And that's where also our current recycling problem is kind of at the moment.
To meet this challenge, the Great Bubble Barrier team is also working hard to find cost-effective ways of sorting the plastic they collect so that it can be reused rather than end up in landfill. New methods of recycling plastic are also being developed that could be useful for the team.
Proof fuel, which is a residue from the car recycling, which is almost everything that you mix together. It's
all the nasty stuff.
This is really nasty. It's like no one wants this one.
In February 2020, Razor's Emma Keeling met a team at Sweden's Chalmers University who have built a test plant that allows mixed plastics to be recycled without sorting.
We're going to focus on capturing the plastics. The processing of the plastic for us is still very important, and it's something that we have also looked at, and we want to make sure that if we're capturing plastics, we're not just, moving the problem to another place. The goal is not to provide basically a waste infrastructure to incentivize throwing a plastic into the river in the first place, because the bubble barrier is just going to clean it up again.
The success of this first bubble barrier shows how simple but innovative technology can stop plastic entering our seas and could be used in rivers around the world.
What does the future hold for your technology?
It makes sense for us and for our size to first, reach out into the neighboring countries and kind of like spread into the European market. But our ambition is definitely to make steps towards Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, and then to hopefully deploy the system worldwide. But for now, Europe, and we're looking at 2022, 2023 to be hopefully launching our first system in Asia.
For more science, behind-the-scenes insights, groundbreaking research, and even some fun, check out our Razor podcast. Search Razor Sounds on all major streaming platforms, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on any episodes.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London, who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN.
The UK's Health Secretary has just ordered the country's National Health Institute to conduct a third review into the role vitamin D may play in our body's defence against COVID-19. Dr. Gareth Davies is one of hundreds of researchers and health professionals upset by earlier dismissals of vitamin D by UK health bodies.
Vitamin stands for vital amino acid, and these are supposed to be amino acids that our bodies can't produce, so vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, etc. But in fact, vitamin D is not a vitamin because we do produce it in strong sunlight. It's produced by UV rays in the summer or strong sunlight in the tropics, and it converts cholesterol in skin cells into various forms of vitamin D. There are actually 5 different molecules that together form the vitamin D group, and it's a hormone. So when I started looking into vitamin D about a year ago, I was doing it for personal reasons, and I was incredibly surprised at how many diseases it's involved with. From cancer to diabetes to respiratory disorders, pretty much across the board. If there's a disease that can have vitamin D involved, it's involved.
Dr. Davis and others conducted their own study into the association between vitamin D levels and COVID-19 mortality rates.
We looked purely at the number of reported deaths and the number of reported recoveries. Now, in the early days of a novel pathogen, those figures are almost certainly going to be coming from hospitals because you don't have anyone else testing or have any other way of knowing whether people are infected. So it's a pretty reliable pair of figures that you can look at.
So you looked at latitudes, and in low latitudes, high sunlight, high vitamin D, you found lower fatalities in COVID outbreaks?
In order to prove cause, we had to do something that's quite unusual in the medical field. So we did, I'm a physicist by training, and so we did a proof which is much more common in physics. It's called a hypothetico-deductive proof, where we take 2 models. We took a causal model where vitamin D is modelled to be causal in outcomes, and a contrasting model where it's not causal. And from those 2 models, we can then make certain predictions. And we were able to make 19 verifiable and falsifiable predictions, which we could then go out to the observed data and compare and see which of the models was closer to the truth. And the results are really quite striking. The causal model agreed, only 16 of the 19 predictions were testable, but of those 16, all 16 were confirmed by for the causal model, and all 16 were falsified for the acausal model. So that's pretty, on its own, is really quite extraordinary. It's quite a bold claim to be making.
The claim being that vitamin D has a causal relationship with poor COVID-19 outcomes. How does that work?
So people that have severe COVID-19 reactions are being admitted to ICUs with something called ARDS, or ARDS-like symptoms, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome. And their lungs are having a very, very severe inflammatory response to the disease. And the system that controls inflammation and blood pressures is called the renin-angiotensin system. You can think of it as having an accelerator and a brake. And the accelerator is depressed when you have an infection, and the brake starts to be depressed just to keep that acceleration from getting out of control. The virus, SARS-CoV-2, attacked something called ACE2, which is a cell receptor, and that is the brake, and the virus breaks the brake. So you end up with a RAS that has an accelerator but a broken brake, and you get something called a cytokine storm, where the inflammatory response is out of control and there's nothing to bring it back under control.
Dr. Richard Quinton is a consultant endocrinologist. During the height of the UK's first outbreak, he found himself in a position to do a more hands-on study at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle.
So it was a small study. In fact, it wasn't even a study, it was a treatment, which we decided to undertake, and we then audited it and shared our findings both locally and to the wider community. We decided that we would identify vitamin D deficiency in COVID-19 patients as part of their routine workup, and then we would suggest a clinical management package which was available for physicians to pick up and use if they wanted. And that management package included a single oral dose of vitamin D of between 1 and 200,000 units, depending on the admission level, that was designed to normalize vitamin D levels within a few days, based on what we know from previous dosing studies. And then this was invariably followed up by a maintenance dose. This is what we did. Clearly, it wasn't a randomized trial. There was no control group. It was a treatment. But then we went back and had audited what happened. There's some interesting things. So first of all, we found out that patients had come in, about 10% had absolutely shockingly low vitamin D levels, virtually below the detection limit for the assay. Second, we found that if you came in with a very low D level, you were likely to end up on intensive care. And actually other bigger studies subsequently have shown that patients with lower D levels, the lower it is, the likely you are to die. In terms of death, the other interesting thing we found was that if you had a decent vitamin D level, so above 75 nanomole per litre, which is that recommended by the American Endocrine Society, then actually you virtually don't die. So apart from, if you're under the age of 90, in our hospital, nobody who comes in with a vitamin D level above 75 nanomole per litre has died so far, which is quite a striking finding.
I'm taking 50 micrograms of vitamin D a day. That's 2 tablets of the normal tablets. Is that a good idea?
Yes, 50 micrograms, that's 2,000 units. Maybe you could manage with a little less. Maybe you could manage with 25 micrograms, 1,000 units, but you're not going to do yourself any harm by that. I think the important thing is that you're taking some, and the important thing is that the dose is 20 to 25 micrograms, 800 to 1,000 units at least. If you take a little bit more, that's not going to do you any harm. In fact, if you're from an ethnic minority, darker skinned, you should almost certainly should take a bit more anyway.
So in simple terms, low vitamin D, poor outcome?
Pretty much, yeah. And it's not, it's important to be clear as well, it's not the only factor. There are some people who will have poor outcomes irrespective of their vitamin D status. That's the nature of life, unfortunately. But it does seem, given the size of the effect that we're seeing, it does seem to be that vitamin D status is the dominant risk factor for poor outcomes. The good news is, of course, that's something that we can modify cheaply and easily, and it's scalable, and it's something that people can take control of themselves today.